Chapter 4. The Western Envisioning of Reality. There are innumerable characterizations of what supposedly defines that cultural orientation. These words from Whitehead's Adventures of Ideas is a useful place to begin our analysis. Between them, the Hebrews and the Greeks introduced notions concerning the status of mankind in general and of individual men in particular, and a discipline and direction in the general exercise of mentality, which in their combination have started the modern phase of progress within the European races. What is useful to note are the identification of the Hebrews and the Greeks as mutually important. In their combination, laying the foundation of Western thought and vision. Both in terms of envisioning the world and man's place within, notions concerning the status of mankind in general and individual men in particular, as well as in predispositions to apply the faculties of mind along specific lines, characterized by a discipline and a direction in the general exercise of mentality. The modern phase of progress within the European races represents the particular historic unfolding of Western civilization, animated by the application of that specific mix of mentality. As well, the contribution originating from the Hebrews can be seen as the first phase of the tradition of faith, while that of the Greeks shows the first solid grounding of the tradition of reason. One of the broad stereotypical ways of looking at Western cultural history is to differentiate traditions of faith and of reason, which have arisen and interacted in diverse ways. We have already enunciated some of the traits of those orientations. As such, we can classify this dichotomy as another example of a basic dualism. Faith has been considered an expression of the emotional, imaginative, intuitional, spiritual strains of the human psyche. And reason has been the formal classification for the logical, intellectual, conceptual, rational side of mind. Their interactivity has produced cultural creations which reflect at times more one than the other of human orientations. Though it also should be stated that the divisions are not absolute, and that many variations, mixes, scales of relative preponderance can prevail at any time. Culturally, the institution of religion has been most associated with expressions of faith. And reason has been embodied in different configurations in both the forms of philosophy and science. All three institutions have and still do serve as the dominant legitimating authorities, though content and speculative inferences have changed over time. The focus on these three forms of course does not presume other significant channels don't exist and serve important functions. For instance, the arts, and the entire aesthetic domain have always served as a significant cultural repository for embodying value and meaning, sometimes serving to enhance and amplify strains of already articulated belief systems, sometimes suggesting more intangible personal and imponderable illusions of significance. The forms, imagery, resonant themes may more easily conform to a prevailing ideational framework or may appear in any degree of flux towards new or less prevalent directions. It should be stated too, that the aesthetic component has always been an important strand in the socially articulated envisioning of reality. And in some cases, perhaps even the major force in maintaining the steady pervasiveness of a given framework. While formal and doctrinal codification and articulation of the tenets of a system take place on the elite authoritative specialist level, the non-verbal and more visceral connectivity to tradition occur in the personal, the social and the aesthetic spheres. As noted, prerational and sophisticated kinds of knowledge are in continual flux and realignment in the representations of reality. The 7 types and 5 forms of knowledge which Gurvich enunciated can be discerned in both those general categories in varying mixes and states of prioritization. It is how they are articulated, valued, defined, within the wider ideational systems that allows the specific content to attain unique cultural form. Sorokin's 3 systems of truth, Burt's 3 types and eras of common sense correction, provide a useful guideline for interpretation. And that is just the reason we have singled out the three cultural institutions of authoritative legitimization. Religion is the institution representing and legitimizing the truth of faith, or intuitionism. Philosophy is the institution embodying the truth of reason, or rationalism. And science is the institution defining and articulating the truth of sense, or empiricism. Although admittedly all such classifications are inevitably simplifications, they do indicate distinct characteristics and historical correlations. And it must also be reiterated that they all subsume other cultural and social elements to some degree, and incorporate different blends of the types and forms of knowledge earlier enunciated. In bringing down the theoretical and formal to the domain of the everyday world, and extending the inquiries of common sense into a more abstract sphere, assimilation becomes a fusion of personal and cultural concerns. Although the elite technicians of the authoritative institutions hone and shape the minutiae of definition and implication, it usually requires a more direct emotional and intuitive connection before the self-evident nature of the framework takes hold pervasively. The prerational and the sophisticated kinds of knowledge are dialectically intertwined within each institution of legitimation as well, though the formal ideational frameworks are inevitably presented as more universally applicable and representative of final truths. Also, the connection between the ideational and the political is significant. The only way a framework of reality can be effective on a large scale is to have the ideas and beliefs pervade the social domain. In some situations, government intervention directly helped promulgate systems espousing a particular vision of reality. In other situations, the favorable relations between government or ruler and proponents of a framework of reality interpretation resulted in advantages of power, patronage, influence, publicity, popularization. And government policy favoring a specific institution or field of endeavor supplies advantages in allowing the general prevailing school of thought of that institution or branch of knowledge to extend their influence and spread their particular vision. In oblique and indirect filtration as well as through direct expression. Conversely, negative or hostile political behavior can crush, hamper, intimidate, neutralize, throw into disrepute any particular institution, movement, school, field of study, individual or group trying to express or maintain an ideational system. Of course, many belief systems have survived intentional political persecution and efforts to discredit and demean. And sometimes strength and determination has been found in face of opposition. So though political connections are significant in both a positive and negative way, they are more of a secondary channel. They don't create the impetus or the vision, but have power to control the way it filters into the given social world. Now, returning to the examination of the three major cultural channels of envisioning and legitimizing, we see that they are significant culturally because they all provide a comprehensive, inclusive vision of reality, in formally structured and publicly accessible form. Whether by direct access or as popularized for wider mass consumption. Scriptures, authoritative commentary, doctrines of belief, sacred texts, interpretive writings, theories and lines of speculation, systematic consolidation of knowledge, schools of thought, teachers and exponents, innovators and disciples, common methodologies and practices, social and practical applications of ideas and so on provide continuity and assurance in the ongoing efficacy of a particular way of envisioning reality. Presentation and validation are reciprocal parts of the legitimizing process. The religious articulation has always been more pervasive and socially available to more people in Western history for two prime reasons. One is the widespread dissemination made possible by a professional priestly class and their institutional repository of traditions and evaluative classifications, a church, or cultural equivalent. The other is that the religious content is primarily evocative of the non-rational affective dimension of the psyche. In other words, feeling, intuition, aspirations, imagination, are the forces primarily prioritized in the religious representations. Expertise and the criteria of verifiable proofs are not essential factors in acceptance of religious visions of reality. Thus, the vast majority of the general public can be exposed to, and personally confront the facts of experience through a religious worldview. On other levels, the edifice of conceptual interpretations and explanations introduces the dynamic of intellectual analysis and judgment. However, the essence of faith still is an appeal to the non-rational component of the self. Its representation, though often is embellished with the use of those tools of rational, intellectual, common sense, perception. Sophisticated or specialized capacity for intellectual comprehension have made the institutions of philosophy and science less immediately accessible to the common man. Traditionally, the fields of philosophy and science, though dealing with the data of observation and experience, require more abstract analytical and synthetic capacities than mere common sense. Thus, the institutional presence in schools, academies, institutes, universities, and so on of specialized experts, though far fewer in number than expounders of religious traditions, the influence of philosophy and science has been widely significant, often trickling down, till the effects and perceptions become part of the everyday vocabulary of interpreting reality. One of the historical factors behind the expounding and popularizing the tradition of reason has been the connection between leading philosophers, schools of thought, scientists, their discoveries, and secular governmental persons of power. Positive acceptance by, and influence over a king, governor, administrator, wealthy patron, and so on has been a means of perpetuating, expanding, expounding philosophic and scientific vision even when the public may be largely unaware at first. The interplay of faith and reason through the institutions of religion, philosophy, and science have produced many interesting historical variations on how reality was perceived and legitimated. We will confine our discussion to what has traditionally been recognized as Western history, though trends, configurations, orientations of other times and places are equally interesting and important. For instance, the Far Eastern constructions and revisions of a reality overview are instructive in their different mixes of experiential valuation. Another topic for another time. Our look at Western religious legitimization starts with the ancient Middle East, and the worldview articulated and legitimized by Hebrew religious tradition. We can say as a basic fact that the valuation of the phenomenal world, the physical environment of objects, things, forces, was not as it appeared, in itself. The objective world was perceived as reflecting the authority of a transcendent supreme God. Yahweh was conceived standing above the world, yet also the source of all reality, including man. The authoritative image of Yahweh, the elevation and inflation of his tribal focus and concern, created a cultural framework by which value was perceived as apart from experience. This quote from Henri Frankfurt is illustrative. The dominant tenet of Hebrew thought is the absolute transcendence of God. Yahweh is not in nature. Neither earth nor sun nor heaven is divine. Even the most potent natural phenomena are but a reflection of God's greatness. It is not even possible properly to name God. The God of the Hebrews is ineffable. He is holy. All values are ultimately attributes of God alone. Hence all concrete phenomena are devalued. Man and nature are necessarily valueless before God. Every finite reality is shriveled to nothingness before the absolute value which was God. With this form of religion serving as a legitimizing authority, the filters and valuation of experience were channeled to serve the criteria of social solidarity and group objectives. The articulation of a complex symbol of extreme power and value enhances some kinds of experience while minimizing and devaluing others. The domain of faith is activated and clarified, and rational perceptions and efforts are clearly placed in a subordinate role, serving to entrench and embellish the priorities of faith. And this radical dualistic orientation also creates a particular self-image of man. All subjective experience, feelings, speculation, manifestation from different levels of consciousness are interpreted in terms of how they conform to the collective symbolic image. The emergence of a radical dualism where man is presumed to be qualitatively inferior to the supreme source of power and value defines how the variety of inner experience is treated. Thoughts, feelings, non-conscious eruption and cultivation of imagery and symbols are encouraged when they conform to the collective cultural vision of reality. And the types of experience which appear to clash or conflict with the prevailing authoritative vision of reality will be distorted, repressed, demonized, denied, rationalized, reconstructed. As preeminent authoritative legitimizing channel, the institution of religion in ancient Hebrew society applied particular shaping, defining, valuative filters to experience. Cultivating conformity, discouraging and condemning what didn't help perpetuate and enhance. However, what about the very fundamental collective root transcendent experience itself? Clearly, to powerfully shape and legitimize a cultural vision of reality, a very intensive dimension of experience must be at work. Let's look at Jung's statement about the religious experience. The psyche is an autonomous factor, and religious statements are psychic confessions which in the last resort are based on unconscious, i.e. on transcendental processes. These processes are not accessible to physical perception but demonstrate their existence through the confessions of the psyche. The resultant statements are filtered through the medium of human consciousness, that is to say they are given visible forms which in their turn are subject to manifold influences from within and without. That is why whenever we speak of religious contents we move in a world of images which point to something ineffable. If new say, God, we give expression to an image or verbal concept which has undergone many changes in the course of time. Our reason is sure only of one thing, that it manipulates images and ideas which are dependent on human imagination and its temporal and local conditions, and which therefore have changed innumerable times in the course of their long history. If we try and interpret Yahweh as such a symbol, we see that the visible form is an expression of local cultural and social ideas and values. Yet, underlying this stratum is a source of non-conscious energy and value, which is felt, intuited, sensed, understood on some level of experience within the particular cultural context. This imbibes the symbol with an effective force and reiterates the authority of the framework of knowledge built around it. In helping articulate and define a radically dualistic worldview, the Hebrew religious form of legitimization also was projected into the interpretation of group purpose and destiny. And this led to a unique morally and socially driven cultural treatment of history. A particularly unique orientation, focus, evaluation and derivation of meaning applied to the objective experience of a specific collectivity on the one hand, and the data of personal subjective experience on the other. The preponderance of contemporary and earlier treatments of history in other cultures was invariably constructed in the language and shape of mythology. The great myths of Egypt and Mesopotamia come to mind. When historical fragments and incidents were used, they were subjugated to the larger purpose of the myth. The regulatory, integrative, reassuring and cathartic elements reiterated the sense of cosmic stability, and legitimized the role of man to the higher powers and forces of the cosmos. Repetition, restatement, reenactment, ritualistic exactitude reinforced the mythic validity of the specific cultural constructions of reality. With the Hebraic model, there is a mix of intentions and of form. The cyclical mythic formula was broken, and a linear end, an objective to history was introduced. And one of the byproducts was a transformation of myth. As J. F. Priest wrote, the Yahweh history and the resultant Yahweh myth was indistinguishable from the history of Israel itself. One can say that the history of Israel is the biography of Yahweh, and this insight provides the justification for the contention that history was in fact the mode of the Israelite expression of myth. One of the transition points was the intense focus on group purpose and worth. With a radical dualism between Yahweh and man, the moral and spiritual objectives of the tribe acquired an urgency and intensity unlike other cultures. The notion of the chosen people carried with it an intended historical objective, though construed and phrased in the vocabulary of myth. And with the unyielding ethical standards enunciated through Yahweh, all of history became the subject matter of this test of group morality and religious dedication. Moral qualities like justice, honesty, mercy, righteousness, honor, dignity were sanctified, while events and their meaning acquired separate meaning. Divine history was conceived as saturated with group signification. From creation through the time of the patriarchs, Exodus, the destruction of the temple, the period of the prophets, and so on, events were expressed as a mixture of history and mythology. Eschatology replacing the mythical eternal return. So by intense focus on the moral dimensions of experience, and the use of religion to legitimize the values and intentions of the culture, a radicalized form of historical perception emerged. Full of mythical traits, yet conceived as directed towards actual realization. With the tribe and its history attaining mythical dimensions, the sense of a cultural exclusivity as subject to a special destiny became a defining characteristic of this form of religious legitimization. And with this version of religion as legitimizing authority, faith became the ultimate expression, most esteemed, valued, idealized, of the deepest connection to ultimate reality. The Book of Job, the spirit implicit throughout the Old Testament, countless scriptural commentaries and supplementary anecdotes, etc., reinforce how crucially essential absolute obedience and faith are. The dualistic qualitative gulfs between God and man and nature, tribal destiny and the role of other nations, etc., have no easy means of resolution. Experience is basically presented as a series of moral tests with a collective part historical, part mythical social objective serving as an encompassing ideal. In Western cultural history, continuity and evolution of the truth of faith, intuitionism, was represented by the next dominating manifestation of radical mythical historical religious legitimization. The main source of the supporting orientation of the Christian Church came from the kind of reality envisioned in the Hebraic worldview. Of course, in the early centuries of its formation there existed a preponderance of generally similar mythical religious ideational systems contemporaneously active. However, the substantive treatments and valuation of the materials was structurally different in one significant way. In Christian tradition, the Hebraic linearization of myth and infusion of historical eschatological ends and objectives was retained and made the foundation for envisioning the true nature of reality. History and myth were blended in the extended and augmented notion of a divine history. The main shift in conceptualization was that more than tribal focus and an extreme moral absolutism were perceived as goals of ultimate aspiration and purpose. Faith was reinterpreted, reformulated, redirected along new channels. In other mythological traditions in Hellenic, Hellenistic, and Near Eastern cultures of the time, the seasonal, social, regulative and cathartic functions of myth generally were structurally consistent, though specific local content and focus of interpretation was variable. But with the blossoming of classical Greek culture, the new esteem for, and application of, the powers of reason served to both humanize the substance of myth as well as provide the basis for alternative ideational institutions of legitimization. As we shall see, the emergence and growth of philosophical academies and schools, of scientific investigation and theorization, provided more specialized alternative frameworks for envisioning reality. However, for the majority, the traditional religious mythic ideational framework still articulated and shaped how experience was interpreted and reality constructed. Although, As reconfigured via the values of reason, a fundamentally distinctive orientation emerged. With the slowly unfolding growth of the Christian Church from being one of a number of similar alternative mythical systems to the dominant social legitimization institution, it was necessary to establish a number of defining differences. At the time of its inception, Christianity was one in a proliferation of various mystery schools, religions, cults, philosophies, etc. And the uncanny similarities in many theories, images, doctrines, symbols, values with Gnostic, Essene, Neoplatonic, Mithraic, Essene, and other systems illustrate that early Christianity drew from many sources for the substance of its theoretical apparatus. As well as those influences, however, by incorporating and building upon the Hebraic historicization of myth, a different infusion of values and direction entered the ideational stream. In fact, whatever the historical facts about the life of the figure of Jesus may indeed be, they become almost secondary in terms of application of mythic structure. Only when incorporated into a transpersonal framework saturated with both ethical and mythical associations does the articulation of a significant, reality-shaping and defining edifice become truly effective. The maintenance of the Hebraic radical insistence on moral priorities as the ultimate criterion linking self to highest source of power and value allowed the figure of Jesus to maintain a dual function. As Jesus, the images, symbols, anecdotal references to everyday human experience allow the focus on ethical dilemmas and ideals to be presented and received in humanized terms. As Christ, the supernatural link to the all-powerful omnipotent Hebraic God is reinforced while still maintaining an intermediary connectivity to mankind. As well, moral behavior and conduct of life is focused more from the perspective of the individual. Personal rather than group salvation is the immediate desirable objective, and this ideal is incorporated into the core of the formal content of the system. At the same time, without extensive adaptation of existing mythic formulae, the appeal to a sense of connectivity have been a more problematic social issue. Use of existing forms and models serve to facilitate familiarity and provide a conceptual and emotional link with notions already part of the climate of thought. For instance, in the myths of the Orphics, of Plato, of Pythagoras, the soul, or starry self, is represented as a figure descending to the mundane sphere, struggling in the chaos of worldly experience, but awakened through transformational insight to his true nature and redeemed. In Gnosticism, the symbolic figure of the Christos stood for the whole human race as engaged in this type of cycle. Redemption was synonymous with true knowledge, or gnosis. The proliferation of many myths of fall and redemption provided a well-known structure for foundational application. As well, a variety of existent mythic and religious beliefs about a Messiah also provided a ready-made set of symbols, images, possible models. And over time, the incorporation of rational grounds of support from other sources served to bolster and solidify the mythic historical ideational construction. As well as drawing from the moral demands, absolutism of power and value of Yahweh, some of the attributes of the Christian God were derived from Aristotle's picture of the unmoved mover, and the activities of the Platonic demiurge as represented in the Timaeus. The Christian conception of the Logos also comes from Platonic, Neoplatonic, Gnostic origins. As an emerging, somewhat fluid and evolving mixture of diverse historical, mythical, cultural, philosophic influences, Christianity needed centuries to establish its own identity and influence on the large scale. For years it existed side by side with other ideational alternatives, and was perceived simply as one of many such systems. It was only when it was given explicit support and prioritization when drawn into the political and power mix of the Roman Empire that its significance as a cultural institution was firmly established. Retroactive revisionist theories shaped by presuppositions of divine history perceived a special status in the struggles and elevation of Christianity. However, the facts point to a confluence of many factors. The growth of the Catholic Church as a preeminent political force over centuries naturally ensured that as a dominant institution, the legitimization of all credible public visions of reality would need to fall within accepted parameters of their own ideational construct. Although a great deal of clever and innovative reshaping and adaptation of new wine in old bottles did occur, there was no explicit way for risk-free publicly presented and supported alternatively envisioned representations of reality. The legitimated framework of values, ideas, ideals, beliefs, assumptions, presumptions, a priori presuppositions, of the secured envisioned reality was explicitly a closed model, purported to be final, absolute, self-contained and impervious to challenge. The conceptual productions of church thinkers during the Middle Ages were often intricate and dazzling efforts to fuse the powers of faith and reason. Led by Aquinas and followed by a number of scholastic thinkers, the application of philosophical analysis and synthesis was used to support and enhance the traditional doctrines of religion. The fact that reason was conceived to be a faculty of mind highly valued and painstakingly applied by an elite class of church thinkers reveals that the tradition of philosophical treatment of experience was an active one. And, according to Whitehead, the Middle Ages were an epoch of orderly thought, rationalist through and through. The validity of the familiar cliché that reason is the handmaiden of faith is instructive. The legitimizing authority of religion in Western history, over time, became less and less self-sufficient on purely emotional lines alone. As rational and intellectual capacities were practiced and expanded in novel directions, it became more and more difficult to keep them repressed or neatly compartmentalized away from the orientation of faith. Yet, with maintenance of political influence and the sheer saturation of centuries of reiterated legitimization, the ultimate worth of reason was persistently denigrated when perceived from within the tradition of faith. The capacities of reason were recognized, but how they were evaluated was determined by the prevailing legitimized orientation. For instance, the practice of philosophy was incorporated into the general system of knowledge, as were many other functions of reason. However, it was prioritized as a supplemental methodology, intended to confer more precise organizational integration to the existing edifice rather than be applied independently or turned to focus on the taken for granted presuppositions of the prevailing system. Thomas Aquinas enunciated it this way. We can use philosophy and sacred doctrine in three ways. 1. To demonstrate items that are preambles to faith. 2. To make known those items that belong to the faith by means of certain similitudes. 3. To oppose statements against the faith either by showing they are false or by showing they are not necessarily true. The self-contained closed system prevailing during the Middle Ages legitimized what may be seen as an otherworldly framework for representing and evaluating the data of experience. The worldview characterized by the patterns enunciated as the great chain of being, in which each facet of life was interconnected and reciprocally dependent in a hierarchy of ascending signification, culminating with God at the apex, the ultimate source of value and meaning. Images, symbols, values, behavioral options which would have been expressed in mythic terms were now firmly presented as pertaining to straightforward linear interpretation of history. The physical world was conceived of having specific dates of creation and destruction, with the appearance of Christ at the temporal center. The exact year of creation was said by Bishop Ussher to be 4004 BC. And a strict polarization of dualities with eternity in hell for the wicked and bliss in heaven for the faithful. Full acceptance of the literal validity of the tenets of Christian scripture was a prerequisite for salvation. All experience was filtered in terms referential to those dynamics. And what was felt, thought, practiced, expressed, speculated, surmised was shaped and understood with those paradigms as part of the wider cultural context. This quote from Ignatius indicates the general attitude cultivated by the Church. Hold deaf ears to anyone who speaks to you apart from Jesus Christ. Who was of the line of David, truly born of Mary, who ate and drank, who was truly tried by Pontius Pilate, was really crucified, and died in the sight of those who looked on from heaven, earth, and the underworld, who was truly raised from the dead when his Father wakened him, just as this Father will raise up all who believe in him, in Christ Jesus, without whom there is no true life in us. Note the repetition of the words, true, and truly. Emphasis is on reiterating the literal validity, the facticity of events enunciated. In fact, the pattern of life, death, rebirth is a very common mythic pattern. In this representative Catholic perspective, mythic structure is counterbalanced by highlighting what the believer perceives and values as the qualitative difference. That this really did happen. That salvation really will happen in a literal linear way. Another element of the traditional Catholic perspective was that the purpose of nature and of human experience was envisioned teleologically. All the events tending to some purpose in God's plan. And with this perspective, following and practicing the ideals expressed by the Church were effective means to assuring eternal salvation. And rebellion or disavowal would invoke eternal punishment in the next world. With the eternal fate of the soul in the balance, the inducement to conformity was reinforced on the deepest psychological levels. And as a cultural legitimizing authority, the Church shaped and defined the way experience was interpreted. Yet, no formal system can effectively persist on the basis of showing only the negative and fear-inducing components. The ideals and actualities of experience must be represented in ways which extricate satisfaction, significance, harmony, value. Toynbee sketches out the fundamental rudiments of that envisioned reality. The history of mankind appeared, through the Christian lens, as an interlude played, in time, and upon the scenes of this world, against an otherworldly background of eternity. It began at a definite moment with the creation of the world. It was to end, equally abruptly, with the Last Judgment, and it was divided into a time of ignorance and a time of grace, as sharply as the universe had been divided by the Creator, on the first day, into the two realms of light and darkness. In the heart of that era, where the prioritization of the truth of faith provided the substance for that form of religious legitimization, it is instructive to look at the way the world of everyday living was influenced. This poem articulates how primary knowledge and sophisticated knowledge are internally incorporated through the dialectical process to produce personal variants of the encompassing socially envisioned picture of reality. Bernard of Morleau put it this way: brief life is here our portion. Brief sorrow, short-lived care. The life that knows no ending. The tearless life is there. And after fleshy scandal. And after this world's night. And after storm and whirlwind. In calm joy and light. There grief is turned to pleasure. Such pleasure is below. No human voice can utter. No human heart can know. The peace of all the faithful. The calm of all the blessed. Inviolate, unvaried. Divinest, sweetest, best. That peace, but who may claim it? The guiles in their way. Who keeps the rank of battle? Who mean the things they say? Strive man to win that glory. Toil man to gain that light. Send hope before to grasp it. Till hope be lost in light. 2. This poem reflects how human experience within this specific culturally envisioned reality was subjectively felt and expressed. The human reactions, hopes, fears, desires, interpretations of the reality they are immersed in reveal a number of dualities and conflicting tendencies. The duality of the brief life of experience and life that knows no ending of religious ideal. The sorrow of actual experience and the tearless life expressed within the formal religious system. The conflicts and ambiguities of life in fleshy scandal, storm and whirlwind, and the calm and joy and light of the tempting afterlife imagery. As well, the qualitative superiority and special status there, in the heavenly sphere, is expressed as a unique type of experience. No human voice can utter. no human heart can know. This implies a transcendent kind of experience, with deep emotive and affective significance. Yet here in the world of normal experience, the dualities stand starkly evident. The calm of the blessed is earned by adhering to the ideals of exemplary behavior. Yet, for the normal flawed person, the only approach is to strive, and toil, and hope. As a whole, this poem pictures a status which can, in essence, be seen as more or less universal in terms of the human condition as conceived through that framework of ideas and beliefs. In this particular example, we have a window into an actual occasion of a human subject living and expressing insight within a reality legitimized by the prevailing religious sets of images, ideals, conceptions. The individual is never a mere byproduct of the system. Each person has their own inner perceptions, values, and body of primary knowledge. However, each individual must use the cultural materials at their disposal to articulate a private reflective outlook. If we move forward in time and look at further development of the Christian framework of envisioning reality, we come to the emergence of Protestantism as the next significant phase of internal transformation. Arising from within the existing Christian worldview, but shaped by a different set of evaluative criteria, we see a new construction based on a revised interpretation of the relationship between faith and reason. The Catholic envisioning of reality made use of its own hybrid forms of historicized mythology to provide a wide enough interpretive structure in which all modes of human experience were contained. With a picture of a reality in which the otherworldly directed drama of salvation or damnation was the central theme of life, integration, evaluation and classification of the full range of human experience was seamlessly enabled, as we have seen. The application of reason, both as a tool of analysis and synthesis, and for pragmatic ends, was formally acceptable when conceived to be a subordinate function in the service of faith. As well, experience of non-rational modes was also legitimated by placement within a hierarchy of doctrinally determined classifications. The source of non-rational types of experience can be hypothesized as emerging from sub- and supra-conscious capacities of the mind, and as expressed can be seen as representative of a wide range of distinct experiential classes. Data of para-hypnotic states, delusional projection, collective, crowd hysteria, spontaneous eruption of psychic capacities and personal mystic vision and more can be extracted from the historical records. Analysis of detail, our questions of credibility and facticity are not our concern. The main point is that all these manifestations of subjective non-rational experience were socially legitimized, felt to be real and authentic, and accepted as such. The ideational system of the dominant institutional legitimizing authority, the Catholic Church, maintained entrenched existing interpretive classifications already in place and ready to apply when necessary. Simply as a logically integrated component of their total ideational apparatus. Not all such experiences were evaluated the same way, of course, even if legitimized as authentic. Some were esteemed and valued when confirming of, and conforming to, the basic presumptions of faith. And when clearly contradictory to those premises or threatening the status quo of the belief system, others were viewed as abhorrent aberrations and consigned to the realm of the devil. And where ambiguity or ambivalence prevailed, judgment went either way, depending on specific circumstances. Where more closely crafted in conformist terms, allowance could be made for a more or less tenuous connection to the authoritative system. Where hostile, antagonistic, or defiant presentment was expressed, provocation of corrective measures, via means of punishment usually ensued. And this kind of evaluative process obviously applied not just to ambivalent non-rational phenomena. The same form of judgment applied for any explicit claims made in violation of, or contradiction to, the accepted beliefs and criteria of the authoritative institution. As a reaction to the domination of the otherworldly orientation of the Catholic ideational system, the Protestant envisioning of reality simply shifted to a different prioritization of experience. The major trait of the movement may be considered the demystification of the Christian ideational apparatus. As a movement emerging in a historical context where reason was being established as the more significant legitimization authority, an effort was made to revivify the traditional religious form with more criteria based on personal and ethical priorities than simple, blind faith in the existing system. Amongst the change in valuation was a de-emphasis on the mechanics of ritual, more of a pragmatic and increasingly historicized reference to the mythic dimension of the tradition, diminution of the collective idealization of the numinous and of monastic spiritual practices, etc. Generally, the more otherworldly elements were devalued, radically reconfigured, or completely dispensed with. The reformulated orientation focused to an almost exclusive concern with the everyday realities of life in an increasingly secular and individualistic culture. As well, the authoritative legitimating power of the Catholic Church was linked to its entrenchment within the political order. With the increasing desecularization and fragmentation of that base, other constructs and mixes were more easily able to obtain footing in public dissemination. If we look at the framework of the general Protestant envisioning of reality, we see a more stark pragmatic and rationalistic extension of the Hebraic and Catholic emphasis on linear interpretation of historicized myth and the moral dimensions of experience. The concepts of grace and salvation became the dominant themes underlying the variety of Protestant ideational formulations. And legitimating credibility was determined by applying specific interpretations and derived corresponding implications from the embodiment of God's Word, the Bible. Ninian Smart supplies this overview. Protestantism made a great difference to the social dimension of Christianity. It tended to replace the patterns of an organic society, of which the institutions of the Church were integrated, with a more individualistic system. The trend in Protestantism was undeniably toward a more individual estimate of man's place in society, which reflected the very personal and individual confrontation between man and his Maker. Though the Reformers in their emphasis on grace and on predestination seemed to take men's responsibility away from them, the effect was rather the opposite. A man individually confronted with God's saving work through grace felt individual responsibility for self-reform. While those who believed in predestination were in the ironic predicament of finding that their sole assurance of salvation lay in the holiness and goodness of their lives. Thus the Reformation re-emphasized the ethical dimension of Christianity, but in a manner rather different from the emphasis given in Catholicism. Doctrinally, the most important single feature of Protestantism was its reliance on the authority of Scripture. The general emergence of a common sense, pragmatic outlook in society at large found its way into Protestant thought. The transition to a demystified set of ideational doctrines meant many of the perennial existential concepts pertaining to the nature of reality were no longer cloaked in mythic form and imagery. The imaginative dimension of visualization and expression was somewhat repressed and redirected, while incorporation of more intellectually coherent and behaviorally rooted doctrines emerged. The ethical criteria pertaining to personal and social conduct and attitude became the sole criteria of determining worthiness for salvation. Focus on the criterion of conscience indicates how prioritization has moved to the domain of individual responsibility. No mere mechanical adherence to proper formalities assuring worthiness. Yet, with the construction of meticulous and ornate doctrines with their extensive implications for behavior embedded with a demystified literally believed eschatological historical fate to be confronted, personal experience became entwined in a causal web of conflicting ideas, ideals, and beliefs. These words from Dr. Johnson's Prayers and Meditations reflect how acceptance of the Protestant envisioning of reality shaped feelings, beliefs, attitudes, thought. Almighty and everlasting God, whose mercy is over all thy works, and who has no pleasure in the death of a sinner, look with pity upon me, enable me to conquer evil habits, and surmount temptations. Give me grace so to use the degree of health which thou hast restored to my mind and body, that I may perform the task thou shalt yet appoint me, and when thou shalt call me to another state, forgive me my sins, and receive me to happiness, for the sake of Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. The mix of piety, humility, fear of ultimate fate, plea for forgiveness and appeal to a higher power for both bodily and spiritual ends reveal how much the Protestant ideational apparatus became internalized. Focus is on the mundane, the domain of everyday reality in terms of how the individual perceives his relationship with God. The moral dilemmas pertaining to evil habits, temptations, degree of health, performing tasks, are perceived as issues with religious signification. As well, the still overwhelming eschatological concerns are the major theme. Divine help for everyday moral concerns is conceived as stimulant to personal responsibility for right choice and action. However, above this, is worry over ultimate spiritual fate, when thou shalt call me to another state. And finally, the gulf between the I and thou is seen in the basic sense of the individual as flawed and an unworthy sinner, who requires mercy, needs forgiveness, pity, grace. The religious focus on moral and everyday matters is most clearly found in the Protestant attitude towards work. Luther's conception of a calling implied that all legitimate forms of activity were sanctioned by God, and that by following his worldly calling, a man's state of grace might be enhanced. The Protestant fusion of otherworldly aspirations and values with this worldly activities and relationships can be seen in this little statement from Luther. Works, since they are irrational things, cannot glorify God, although they may be done to the glory of God if faith be present. Work, considered as intrinsically irrational, is only considered to attain spiritual significance when approached with a properly reverent attitude. As well, implied in proper attitude is possibility of personal acquisition of religious merit. And, with Calvin, we see an interesting twist of logic in linking strict literal eschatology with the realm of work. Calvin's doctrine of predestination, with ultimate fate of individuals already decided, left little room to encourage intensive commitment to the irrational thing of work. However, by introducing the premise that good works may not alter fate, but yet reveal signs of this final status, glorification of God, was still a personally meaningful approach. The directing of religious sentiment, attitude, feeling, thought to the domain of the everyday world of work, interpersonal relationships, personal ethical behavior was concurrent with wider historical changes. The rising esteem of the applications of reason both in theory and production meant that a purely monolithic framework of the religious envisioning of reality had a less encompassing domination, though certainly maintaining a still collectively powerful persuasion. One of the byproducts of the Protestant orientation was that the only way the status of the soul could be measured was by reference to worldly activities. By approaching work, relationships, personal behavior with an implicitly religious set of references, the world of everyday experience became the environment in which the individual could exert active control over his actions. Otherworldly doctrines informed the choices and attitudes of everyday life, but in practical perspective, work itself became the recipient of the projected values. Max Weber called it the spirit of capitalism. And the dedication to a work ethic became an animating force which helped transform the world of economics. At the same time, with the demystification of nature, recognition of a mechanistic scientific approach to theoretical and practical concerns, elevation of reason as a mental activity deemed trustworthy, the concerns of Protestant religion as mostly moral-centric likewise had little need for the non-rational. While the Catholic worldview had room for a polarized acknowledgement of the legitimate validity of sub- and supraconscious experience, Protestantism, devoid of the same mythic framework, marginalized the claims of same experience even more. Of course, the historical record shows plenty of hybrid description of such experiences framed in various Protestant-influenced forms. Swedenborg, Boehme, the nature mysticism of Whitman and the English Romantics, etc. However, often the imagery and presentations either distort the traditional terminology for expressive purposes or use more secular symbols and language. Thus, the explicit aims and structure of Protestantism contain little positive reference or validation of phenomena of the non-rational. The everyday environment of an increasingly secular world was the direction legitimization was focused. While Protestantism was evolving, the influences of secular prioritization and the effects of science and technology continued transforming the economic and social environment. And it was in the 19th century perhaps where the most compartmentalized conceptual division between rationalistic and scientific reason and faith interpreted as an inspirational and morally focused force can be found. Although religion was not the sole or definitive legitimizing authority anymore, it still exerted influence and supplied rationale and meaning, supplying an ideational overview sanctifying the world of everyday experience with a metaphysical justification. But, with the objectives of the Protestant religious frameworks most directed to issues of morality and conduct, accommodating the day-to-day realities of a secularized world, the eschatological apparatus often receded from the forefront, becoming more a reminder of ultimate ends than the determinative force of everyday life. Religion became reassigned into social life more and more shaped on secular priorities, and for many, solely acknowledged formally through church service on the day of rest. FSC. Northrop illustrates this evolving dynamic in an example within a 20th-century academic context, where philosophy and science had already redefined the grounds of knowledge. Thus it happened that as the Protestants moved away from medieval Rome further and further into the modern world, priding themselves upon their freedom of thought and their acceptance of modern knowledge, the more the traditional doctrines of Western religion became mere empty words devoid of philosophical and scientific content, and the greater became the discrepancy between what the student learned about man and nature during the 6 days of the week in his courses in physics, psychology and sociology and what he heard in the university chapel on Sunday morning. Throughout the 20th century, institutional religion became more and more subjugated to other more seemingly pertinent authoritative forms of legitimization. With more and more dichotomy in life between sacred and profane modes of experience and orientation, the traditional Western religious ideational forms appeared unable to adequately explain and comfortably reconcile appearances and their purported meaning without contradiction or necessitating a compartmentalized mindset. The retreat to a role of mostly moral concern increasingly meant more of an articulation in existential terms. The complexities of subjective life, the enigmas of experience, seemingly vast unconnected gulf between manifestations of human darkness and supposed transcendent purpose have been some of the problems confronting traditional religious proponents. After centuries of expounding variations of a linear literalist eschatological purpose to life and the cosmos, the Western forms of religion have had to struggle in pouring new wine into old bottles. Which is not to deny that for large segments of the population the religious frameworks do indeed provide fully acceptable presentation of experience. On the more effective emotional pole of experience, those constructs maintain a power to move and to comfort many. And as well, rationalized, updated, and reconfigured ideational presentations have appeared fully adequate for a significant portion of those trust the institution of religion to define and explain the nature of reality. However, in widest social context, religion as prime or sole means of legitimating reality has proven more problematic in a more secular and rapidly changing era. The 20th century has seen many variations of reconstructed traditional religious envisioning. On the most elementary level, the appeal to almost pure non-cognitive feeling and belief in faith as legitimate mode of validation in itself is found in the various versions of fundamentalism. The desire to forge a direct connection to what is perceived as the essence of tradition results in a compromised form of behavior. Selective choice of material and meanings reflect an attitude which fails to account objectively for the complexities and nuances which legitimately challenge those fundamentals in the first place. Inflation of a vision of the past as a purer, golden age, which can easily be replicated and reintroduced reflects a state of crisis, and in fact is consistent with mythic desires to return to the source of tradition and value. In mythic terms, this desire is expressed ahistorically and ritualistically. Only when severe social crisis threatens does a hope for a literal messiah and return to, or duplication of, a golden age, appear. And in 20th century religious fundamentalism, this sense of fear and dissatisfaction with the status of the surrounding secular world also animates the same attitudes. Other types of reconceptualization range from making basic beliefs and doctrines more relevant and more modern, to complex discourse which adds new connecting concepts from old form to newer insights and perspectives. The former approach can be seen both in local community contexts, where day-to-day behavior and moral issues are processed through updated filters, and in numerous apologetic and proselytizing contexts, where pragmatic worth is used to challenge competitive alternatives. The latter perspective can be found in more technical philosophical presentations, such as the Neo-Thomist tradition, critiques and adaptations of individual thinkers, including the interjection of existentialist premises, in the scientific treatises where faith is tied to empirical commentary and so on. In other words, where religion itself grafts the techniques and data of philosophy and science into its own ideational apparatus and attempts to defend its legitimizing authority with help from other distinct approaches. At this stage, we have seen that the dynamics of the Western religious representation of reality dealt with criteria of both faith and reason. As structured, reason, though significant as a supporting function, remains the secondary function. The various other modes of experience were either dualistically categorized and treated by the Catholic system or debunked, ignored, denied, secularly represented in Protestant tradition. Increasing historicization and eschatological treatment of mythic religious content by Judaism, Catholicism, Protestantism resulted in a polarization of sacred and profane domains, with religion retreating more and more to a status of connecting morality and cosmic purpose. And with the erosion of a pure legitimization of reality through faith, religion in the modern Western world has had to adapt and react to other methods of envisioning reality. Where still presented as a single methodology of envisioning reality, severe compromises or disingenuous treatment of facts easily results. Religion as legitimizing framework of a comprehensive vision of reality incrementally moved from the otherworldly grounding of the Middle Ages to the more worldly fulcrum of ethical and social concern valuation through the 20th century. Throughout that century, many attempts were made to infuse perspectives explored in the realms of philosophy, such as existentialism in the thought of Marcel, Berdyaev, etc., the Neo-Thomism of Gilson and Maritain, etc., and science, as in the theories of Teilhard de Chardin, and others. Along the way, reinterpreting and reconstructing some of the meanings of the basic Christian mythos. As such, though certainly still the prime channel of envisioning for large masses of the population, in many scenarios and circumstances, a bridge between the domain of faith and tradition to the wider secular frameworks of knowledge was necessary to ensure a degree of legitimacy. As well, the proliferation of knowledge and contact with other non-Judeo-Christian religious traditions forced more revision and reassessment of all phases of religious doctrine. We have seen that the tradition of Western institutional religion, primarily Christianity, has inevitably moved from an orientation of otherworldly absolutism to a focus directed at ethical and social issues, although the eschatological dimension remains as the definitive legitimizing rationale. In the world of the 20th century, Western institutional religions were faced with a number of challenges and were forced to adapt, re-evaluate and redefine many traditional presumptions or move in another direction, as well as recognize the plurality and diversity of other traditions. In some instances, rather than face a degree of instability and the unknown, movements have arisen towards a more entrenched, back to the basics, fundamentalism. So by the end of the 20th century and into the next, even within the basic eschatological framework, a mix of orientations coexisted at a variety of different points on the plane of envisioning reality. Chapter 5. As we have seen, religion was the vehicle for embodying a particular perspective on reality in Western history. One which placed prime importance on exercise of faith, appealing to the affective side of personality. Though reason and the rational capacities were valued in different ways, they were still considered subordinate. In contrast, the preeminence of the use of reason can be traced in both philosophical and scientific traditions. These at times have been historically intertwined and in some ways, represent a similarity of attitude and technique. Both express a valuation of the rational capacities of the mind to comprehend and describe the world of experience and legitimate a vision of reality. However, we have differentiated these traditions for a few reasons. Primarily, in philosophy, the evidence of the senses was merely data for analysis and consideration. The starting point for speculation, including questions of validity and meaning. In science, evidence of the senses was taken as a fundamental given. Trustworthy as evidence of a world of reality which could be confidently explored via empirical methods. The philosophical approach as well has traditionally been more concerned with universal inclusive truths which encompass particulars, while the scientific attitude works from the particular up to the general theory. Philosophy has traditionally been the domain of the theoretical, which has encompassed and shaped the interpretation of experience in various ways. Often as a vehicle for understanding subjective processes and objective environment, and for guiding conduct both in the personal and in the wider social spheres. Science has also produced comprehensive envisioning of reality based on interpretation of data of experience. However, the theories of science have often been self-contained, without explicit moralistic intentions or presumptions of a priori credibility detached from sense experience. The envisionings of science are primarily expressed in practical terms based on experiment and objectively testable hypotheses. The evolution of the philosophic tradition in Western history significantly impacted the way reality was represented. We shall start with a look at the so-called birthplace of Western philosophy, classical Greek culture. In a society where an elaborate and inclusive mythic system was already in place, it isn't necessarily the outer forms which first reveal a break in perceptions and a different way of envisioning experience. In the Greece of antiquity, the materials of myth served as they do in most cultures, as socially regulatory, emotionally cathartic, theoretically speculative functions. They provided a ground for legitimizing particular orders of relationship, hierarchical structures of power, ritualistic techniques, comprehension of the meaning of subjective and objective experience. Cornford put it like this: besides the notions of God and soul, we shall find that philosophy also inherits from religion the governing conception of a certain order of nature, variously regarded as a dominion of destiny, of justice, or of law. However, the Greek orientation perhaps was more adventurous and inquisitive in application of powers of speculation and reasoning. The dynamics of geographical, political, social scenarios can be seen as stimulants of a trend towards more urgent testing of the parameters of the ideational status quo. And, while the forms and substance of myth were still the foundation for collective legitimization of reality, the revisioning of meaning became pervasive in different cultural treatments. In art, the orientation towards a valuation of the domain of man as intrinsically embodying an independent qualitative worth is clearly evident. Though the gods are powerful, capricious, immortal, they are envisioned as reflecting many of the same traits and dualities as man. Perceived collectively as macrocosmic creators, sustainers, destroyers, they likewise are more and more humanized in image and story. Especially in drama, where their personification of cosmic powers and force become transmuted into psychological and moral contexts of reference. The powers of the gods are almost completely perceived in terms which provoke further wonder and wider speculation. Enigmas of fate, struggles of the individual to control his destiny, the purpose of man in the cosmos, the dualities of the rational and irrational, ambivalence of interpersonal relationships, the limits of free will and so on are some of the underlying themes evoked in classical Greek drama. Bohra wrote, "The Attic tragedians transposed the disturbing problems and the passionate disputes of the Athenian democracy to the world of ancient myth and gave to them a distance and a dignity which made their issues clearer and set them above the ephemeral controversy." Torn from their contemporary context, these questions are revealed in their ultimate urgency and given a new life through the myths which enfold them. With ethical, metaphysical, psychological and other orders of speculation more and more removed from implicit mythical satisfactory legitimation, the role of reason emerged as the primary technique of inquisition. And, as such, the recognition and acknowledgement of the powers of reason was explicitly a matter of significance. Throughout Greek culture, the pride in individuality and the powers of reason is apparent. And in philosophical speculation, reason is treated with reverence and respect as a uniquely human capacity to universal truths and understanding. And while the recognition of a full range of rational and irrational, conscious and unconscious modes of experience was accepted, the supreme possibilities of reason were valued the most. If we look at the inquiries of Parmenides, Empedocles, Plato and Aristotle specifically, we see that they treated the act of philosophical inquiry as the most legitimate extension of reason. With Parmenides, the data of sense observation was irrelevant when compared to the capacities of logic. In his view, sense knowledge was untrustworthy and only valued as opinion. True knowledge was based on the logical principles of reason. In his dichotomy, being, or what is, represents the realm of the true. Non-being is that which is not, and is classified as illusion. This meant that the data of sense experience was really appearance, with characteristics of change, motion, plurality, etc. And since true being could not include non-being, it ultimately was false knowledge. There remains, then, but one word by which to express the true road. Is. And on this road there are many signs that what is has no beginning and never will be destroyed. It is whole, still, and without end. It neither was nor will be, it simply is, now, altogether, one, continuous. So through trust in the legitimacy of reason and logic, an abstract conceptual picture emerges, not dependent on the senses, emotions, other modes of experience. With Empedocles, the distinction between what is and is not was retained, but with more credibility placed in the senses. He conceived of four basic roots, derived from the world of senses: earth, water, fire, air. These were the logical qualities of eternality, permanence, consistency. These elements serve as the source of phenomenal manifestation, personified as pairs of dual forces, unification, or love, division, or strife. Through their reciprocal activity on the four elements, passage from a state of unification to one of division and back again was envisioned as a perpetual process. In combining the principles of logic with the data of observation, we see an early attempt to construct a vision of reality where appearances were both representative of abstract truths yet maintaining a degree of self-subsistence. With Plato and Aristotle we have differing orientations to the same issues. Plato felt there was a distinction between true and false knowledge, but that each type of knowing pertained to separate states of being. Sense knowledge related to the world of appearances, rational knowledge pertained to the world of reality, or ideas. Plato focused on the distinction between being and becoming, with the perspective that each state maintained its own type of legitimacy, although related in a fundamental way. In the Republic, Theaetetus and sophist Plato says that true knowledge must be of what is, and that it must be infallible. He shows that sense perception fails to meet this criterion since it only deals with what is impermanent and in the process of becoming, unable to explain non-sensed facts or knowledge gained by reflection. Yet true knowledge is not just true judgment or belief, as a judgment may be logically correct but factually erroneous. True knowledge was of universals, stable, fixed, general concepts. True knowledge could be both of a higher and lower order. The lower type involved knowledge of particulars, the objects of scientific definition and observation. Higher knowledge was the authentically true knowledge of universals, knowable by reason, not the senses. In further speculation in the Republic, Plato says that there are distinct stages of thought, and that it is possible to ascend from the lower to the higher. On the lower stage, of opinion, the world is perceived through the senses. Opinion consists of two different faculties. Conjecture gives awareness of images. Belief provides knowledge of objects. This is the world of becoming, of appearances. The higher stage relates both to things and to thought. It consists in understanding, which involves mathematical ideas, and the exercise of reason, which operates in dialectical process, concerned with universal ideas. This is the world of true reality, of being. Plato believed that the world of ideas, or forms, intelligibles, universals, corresponded objectively to the contents of dialectical reasoning. And that the ideas exist in themselves, unaffected by the conditions of time, space, of the phenomenal world. However, the objects of sense found on the lower plane are inferior copies of the ideas. Plato tried to show the connection between idea and copy in two ways. One was the theory of similarity, in which certain characteristics are maintained, but not the entirety of the idea. The other was the theory of participation, where changes in the objects known by the senses were perceived to be the entry and departure of ideas. Together, both theories are still not fully comprehensive yet, so a third concept was needed. That of innate knowledge. This theory states that the eternal ideas exist apart from the human mind, which only remembers the connection when seeing a copy. In the Phaedrus, this theory is expanded to incorporate the hypothesis of reincarnation, by which knowledge in and between incarnations is forgotten, re-experienced, and subsequently remembered. Plato infuses his metaphysical, epistemological and ontological rationalistic speculation with religious and ethical values and concerns. The foundation is built on principles of logic and reasoning, but the implications and inferences are equally expressive of moralistic and transcendent objectives. Intellect operates as the constructive power while a spiritual orientation filters and shapes the conceptual edifice. This comes out most with discussion of the soul. Only the soul that has beheld truth may enter into this our human form, seeing that man must need understand the language of forms, passing from a plurality of perceptions to a unity gathered together by reasoning. Such understanding is a recollection of those things which our souls beheld aforetime as they journeyed with their God, looking down upon the things which now we suppose to be, and gazing up to that which truly is. Now, as we have said, every soul has, by reason of her nature, had contemplation of true being, else would she never had entered into this human creature. But to be put in mind thereof by things here is not easy for every soul. Few indeed are left that can still remember much, but when these discern some likeness of the things yonder, they are amazed and no longer masters of themselves, and know not what is come upon them by reason of their perception being dim. Clearly, the concept of innate knowledge is more than a logical deduction or rational principle. It equally reflects a wider experiential motivation and orientation. Along with other key elements of his envisioning of reality, it elevates the ascending degrees of understanding to special spiritual status. Where reason was the handmaiden of faith, in various ways in the Western religious constructs, we here have somewhat of a reverse of roles. For there is a path to knowledge leading upward through predetermined stages, from the name or the word, to the statement, and thence through image, view and perception, to the higher and highest forms of knowledge. Ascent and descent must be repeated often, the forms of the understanding on the various levels must be rubbed against one another, until finally, after toil and labor, rational insight finally lights up. The goal is an intellectual vision of the highest reality. The path leading to it leads to something that cannot be said in words. This may almost suggest a mystical realm and a path to personal salvation, provided we do not think of mysticism in terms of wild ecstasy, and of salvation in doctrinal terms. As the leading figure of Western philosophical tradition to that point in history, and indeed, as influence, maintaining that status for centuries, and longer, Plato created a mode of envisioning reality which clearly is based primarily, if not exclusively, on the supreme valuation of reason. The creation of an inclusive and self-consistent envisioning of reality by the reasoning mind without compromise or relegation to a subordinate role provided the foundation for the institution of philosophy to serve as a credible legitimizing authority. Perhaps equally important a figure in the social entrenchment of philosophy as a means of interpreting reality was Aristotle. While sharing many common presumptions with his teacher Plato, Aristotle diverged with more of a focus and valuation of the phenomena of the sensible world. Where Plato perceived the world of ideas as more qualitatively significant, Aristotle dealt with analysis and classification, then constructed a theoretical framework to synthesize his reflections. The breadth of Aristotle's study was enormous. These included the fields of meteorology, physics, the known facets of the natural sciences, history, metaphysics, ethics, politics, psychology, logic, rhetoric, aesthetics, history, literature. Aristotle believed that the rational mind of man was capable of comprehending and representing the entire scope of reality, both in its objective content and as subjectively experienced. Aristotle's logical analysis of rational thought shows his confidence in reason as the valid means of both analysis and synthesis, capable of perceiving and representing a full vision of reality. His division of rational thought into the 10 categories of substance, quality, quantity, relation, place, date, position, state, action and passivity stands as a landmark of intellectual achievement. As well, his analysis of the nature and types of syllogisms has been central in defining the criteria of truth in Western thought. And his distinction between scientific, dialectical and contentious syllogisms has served as a framework for both inductive and deductive modes of argumentation. Like Plato, he too was interested in the ways of knowing, and the relation between rational synthetic thought and the data of sense impression. In his critique of Plato's theory of forms, he took an attitude which placed more value of sense impressions. He saw Plato's theory as too remote and detached from the world of sense, impossible to be the cause of things or objects of true knowledge. Aristotle believed the things perceived by the senses maintained the status of ontological authenticity, but were acted upon by universal forms dependent on the actual objects rather than the other way around. The theory of immanent substantial forms and efficient causation as the link between pattern and copy was his way of connecting particulars and universals. And, by thinking of individual things as partaking of true substance, they were allowed to maintain their own independent status. By analyzing substances into form and matter, it was possible to think of form as immanent, shaping matter according to distinct and distinguishable types. For individual things, the forms consist of different classes. the most clearly identifiable being that of species. The form of a thing was thought to immanently determine the structure of the object, thus following Plato and others in assigning matter an inferior status. Aristotle conceived matter as a virtual entity, with the capability of becoming one thing or another, but requiring the reception of an informing form. Change was perceived as the privation of a given form from matter, and the informing of matter by another form, as a consequence of the capacity of matter for successive determination. Thus matter cannot exist without form, but form can exist without matter in eternal, immaterial, intellectual substance. The question of becoming in the relation between form and matter leads to Aristotle's ideas about actual and potential being. The form of a thing can be recognized as the thing's actuality, while the matter which has not yet been shaped as that thing potentially. But actuality must always predate potency, because the cause of a potential being's actualization is always an pre-existing actual form. And to Aristotle, things cannot move themselves, so changes of quality, of quantity, of position, require a cause already in act, like all actualizations of potentiality. This leads to Aristotle's famous teleological interpretation of actuality. Purpose has been introduced into the system via the conceptions of material, efficient, formal and final cause. And like Plato, Aristotle must reach beyond the familiar scope of intellection when moving to speculate about purpose and meaning. In hypothesizing of a transcendent teleological end driving all things to realize their forms as perfectly as possible, and postulation of an interconnected hierarchical order to the universe, Aristotle synthesizes the data of observation, the insights of cognition, and the impetus of idealized values. Reason builds the foundation, connects the materials for systematic organization. The speculative inferences and conclusions of the final ideational framework require intuitive and imaginative shaping and explication. As with Plato, Aristotle envisioned a reality in which reason was the most desirable and esteemed quality, the highest criterion of value in human experience. However, Aristotle focused more on discerning reason in manifestation, Plato more on uncovering and exploring the meaning of the universal principles. Each produced comprehensive ideational systems in which metaphysics served as foundation for all dimensions of personal and social life, with the particularly envisioned understanding of reason as the underlying unifying premise. Zeller put it this way: a comparison with Plato's system reveals, despite many connecting links, to which belongs the retention of an idealism in the sense of referring the universe to a mental principle and referring the spiritual to the material, a far-reaching fundamental difference between the two philosophers. Aristotle is a contemplative character, an observer and a discoverer. He regards the world, which he is convinced is eternal, as a given magnitude which he analyzes with his thought. At the same time he is a powerful organizer of science. But although endowed with a great gift for speculation, he lacked completely the ardent spirit of a Plato, fired with a passion for reform that in the final analysis was inspired by mysticism. Aristotle's break with dualism finds its final expression in his practical and theoretical attitude to the world. Both his ethics and politics are concerned exclusively with this world. It lacks the transcendental standard which Plato found in constant contemplation of the supersensual world of the ideas. Greek philosophical tradition, expressed most fully by Plato and Aristotle, reveal bold and innovative confrontations between the observant, analytical, synthetic faculties of mind and the materials of experience, both subjective and objective. With Plato the orientation expressed more of evaluation and focus on the subjective capacities, with Aristotle, more on the objective field of experience. Both however recognized and dealt comprehensively with the full range of knowledge as understood in their cultural context. And both laid lasting foundations for future directions in application of philosophical method. Throughout the Middle Ages, Plato and Aristotle were the major philosophical influences, though input from other schools also can be traced. However, as discussed earlier, the transition in eras produced a very different configuration of criteria and priorities in legitimizing constructions of reality. Despite an intensive and sophisticated tradition of philosophical practice over the centuries, the explicit aims and intent were severely compromised. As handmaiden to faith, free, unrestricted and open-ended speculation was simply a difficult proposition. Certainly confining enough to preclude bold and novel cultural adaptation and revisioning. We have touched upon some of the dynamics in discussing religion as a legitimating institution, particularly how the enterprise of philosophizing was in essence envisioned as an adjunct for reinforcement of the worldview of faith. And, although there indeed were a variety of individualistic constructs, the overwhelming historical effect tended to be one of homogeneity in terms of basic vision. So, in lieu of a detailed analysis of the subtle nuances and internal variations, we simply will supply a quote from Barnes, An Intellectual and Cultural History of the Western World, to indicate the tenor of the mood and the general time frame. According to Barnes, first we have what have come to be known as the Dark Ages from Augustine to Abelard, roughly from AD 500 to 1100. This was an era when pagan learning gradually faded out and neither Byzantines nor Muslims had yet reintroduced classical scholarship into Western Europe. Then we have the period of high scholasticism which lasted from Abelard to William of Ockham and Duns Scotus at the close of the 13th century. In this age, Aristotle became supreme, the universities arose, and Christianity was fused with Greek logic. Then we come to the 14th and 15th centuries, when the revived classical knowledge and the Muslim scholarship bore fruit in Western Christendom. Scientific interest grew apace and the intellectual results were truly impressive. Classical scholarship broadened and improved. New literary currents were in evidence. The medieval synthesis was undermined and European culture set out on the high road to the modern age. Of course it is somewhat simplistic and utterly naive to even imply that 1,000 years of thought can be represented in a single paragraph. Especially when considering the cross-fertilization of cultures and the incremental influx of different influences. However, though admittedly a simple general overview, the essential categorical truths are fairly accurate. The dominant legitimizing institution during that era was religion, particularly as represented by the Catholic Church. And despite minor revisions and episodic conflicts, it did sustain itself as authoritative, even as philosophy and science were consolidating as secondary influences. So let us fast forward to where the next major impetus behind the authoritative emergence of philosophy can be discerned. The roots of this evolution can be found appearing explicitly at the time of the Renaissance. As much a change in attitude as anything else, the prime characteristic of the Renaissance philosophical approach was a self-confidence and assurance in the rational powers of the individual. Of course, the Renaissance phenomenon involved progress, growth, change, restructuring in diverse fields. With the movement towards secularization in the social and political world, the fragmentation into smaller countries and states, the blossoming of exploration, the emerging independence of scientific speculation, a new dynamic to commerce, a steady progress in practical innovations, a sustained creative impetus in the arts and so on, a fertile ground was established. Perhaps the most representative attitude emerging was that of humanism. Muller wrote, essentially, the distinctive values of the Renaissance were the Greek values. The natural man, in the Middle Ages, had been hidden behind the pious fictions, or portrayed only as a sinful man. Now the humanists became conscious of his worth, and gave much freer play to his creative powers. They idealized both the human body and the human spirit. They discovered new possibilities of truth, beauty, goodness, and joy, and the further possibility of harmonizing them. They discovered the individual, in pride rather than fear, and made him eager to be himself. And they were more than ardent because their humanism embraced the good earth and heaven too. Of course, the idealized, distinctive values, translated more ambivalently when embodied in actual cultural forms and social institutions. However, as a precursor to a more focused effort at a wider revised rationalistic envisioning of reality, the proper study of mankind as man became the sympathetic resonant tone and explication of the characteristics and criteria for this type of envisioning came with most esteem and intellectual authority through the institution of philosophy. Even though the empirical sciences were also revived and growing, the aesthetic domain had blossomed in a variety of ways, and the political and economic systems were in a state of dramatic flux. It was the Christian religious frameworks that were still the most formally entrenched institutions for the representation of reality. But with a renewed valuation of the individual, philosophical study attained increasing status and credibility. Over roughly the time of the Renaissance to the Industrial Revolution, philosophical speculation appeared through a variety of differing authoritative streams. At times one school or another would emerge as favored and respected. The evolution and establishment of largely self-sufficient universities served to provide both a social nexus of knowledge as well as a grounds for continued speculation and ideational formulation. And subsequently with wider social dissemination through the intellectual elite, the substance of philosophy infiltrated further into the legitimating apparatus. Freed from subordinate status, the institution of philosophy acquired more credibility as an independent means of discerning and representing the true nature of reality. In his vast survey in The Sociology of Philosophies, Randall Collins noted the dramatic emergence of philosophy as an independent institution of inquiry and envisioning. In comparison to what went before, modern European philosophy comes on with a bang. Creativity revives in many directions, beginning around 1600, and is sustained for generations. Not least as the core of abstract philosophy itself. There is a takeoff in epistemology, which becomes much more thorough and central than in any previous philosophical community. Metaphysics too has a surprising rebirth, often spurred by the new epistemology. Value theory flourishes along aggressive new paths in aesthetics, ethics, and political philosophy. All this happened with an explicitly innovative consciousness that contrasts with the surreptitious character of creativity in most earlier epochs. In addition, and most spectacularly, there is the scientific revolution of the same period. This overlaps with the networks of philosophers, especially in its formative generations. Henceforward science becomes a key reference point, whether positive or negative, for philosophers. Science rearranges the rest of intellectual space. Collins examines at great length and in much detail the structural foundations underlying the enterprise of philosophy. Following just one of his many illuminating concepts, we arrive at an important delineation of the way philosophy is institutionally grounded. The skeletal structure of creativity is its network lineages, and the history of modern philosophy can be traced through a surprisingly small number of social circles. These are circles in a strong sense, groups which regularly meet, in which everyone knows everyone else. They are self-conscious. Typically they have a name, as well as allies. And often enemies on the outside. Usually they have a program and issue their manifesto. They are the material core of intellectual movements. They are social movement organizations. They are the nodes at the center of networks, recruiting and publicizing and thereby building waves of creative energy in intellectual attention space. For the time when intellectual life moved outside the church and the universities, circles provided the indispensable stage and backstage machinery of theater. The key circles of modern Europe are those which reorganized the means of communication. They set up networks of correspondence and created the first intellectual periodicals. The intellectual circles of the 1600s were full of diplomats, refugees, and commercial travelers. In the absence of a postal system, they controlled the key resource for organizing a truly cosmopolitan network, making possible the meta-circle of circles which emerged in this period. Later in the century, the dominant circles arose where they could find new bases of collective material support, academies which did not depend on individual patronage relations. Still later, such circles captured university positions or formed out of student groups, although the shift back into the university base usually replaced circles with academic lineages. Groups arise where they control a special niche in the means of intellectual production. Each new phase in the development of the publication's business tends to have associated with it a famous intellectual circle. Collins enunciates a number of specific circles and their connections with various formal and informal groups and schools of thought. Historically identifying an eminent 15 inches as most critical in dissemination of the main currents of philosophical thought. Not every single important or influential thinker necessarily played a prominent role in a given circle, but even though in direct influence of ideas yet were connected. He continues. The major and secondary philosophers did not all belong to one or another of these circles, but a large proportion did. If not members, virtually all of the important philosophers were at least connected to one or more circles. The circles energize the creativity. Some of the greatest philosophers are connected to multiple circles, members of none. The greatest creativity consists in making new conceptual combinations, playing off the opposition of existing groups, and laying down new alliances that become institutionalized in the groups of the immediate future. Circles are the accumulators of attention and the resonators of emotional energy. The sparks which fly between them are the thoughts of persons situated at the nodes where the networks intersect. The historical development and the influence on thought of those circles is admirably articulated by Collins. For our purposes, we may now diverge from his narrative and focus more on thematic content. Admittedly a simplified generalization, we may say that as a legitimating institution in modern Western civilization, philosophy attained superior esteem and status as traditional institutional religion receded and before science fully ascended. Further, if we simplify the variety of historical configurations, we can say that there are four main phases in the philosophically envisioned worldview generally expressed during that time frame. These are, first, the growth and development of the rationalist position, exemplified by Descartes, Spinoza and Leibniz. And contemporary but opposite in orientation was the empirical perspective, as found in Locke, Berkeley, Hume. The third phase was initiated by Kant's so-called Copernican revolution. And out of these sources comes a final flowering of philosophical dominance, the Hegelian system and its extensions. This perspective of course recognizes that other trends and movements were active. And that even more progress, growth, emergent outlooks have come to pass since the 19th century. Including many directly based on these foundations. However, in terms of validating status in the cultural mix, these movements within that time frame appear to be the dominant. When we look at the spirit of the rationalist approach, the defining statement may have been Descartes, "I think, therefore I am." With a confident assurance and pride, the individual's faculty of cognition was elevated to highest status. What was knowable via rational operation was what was true and certain. Every clear and distinct apprehension must be something, and consequently cannot proceed from nothing, but must have necessarily been produced by God, who, being supremely perfect, can never be the cause of any error. Consequently, every clear and distinct apprehension must be true. Using propositions of mathematics and principles of mechanics to formulate an interconnected web of logical deductions and conclusions, the end result was a system elevating the role of individual ego as knower, perceiving and acting within a structurally mechanistic universe. And God was introduced as the most perfect being, the highest concept capable of being achieved by thought, useful for instituting and maintaining the cosmic process. In order to connect the mechanistic model of the operational universe to the phenomenon of experiencing egos, Descartes proceeded with a fully dualistic rationale. There was the realm of mind, or soul, occupying bodies of matter, which was an extension of God. God's omnipotence allowed for the interconnectivity between body and mind. The material world was comprehensible through the principles of mathematics, revealing extension, divisibility, motion, figure. God served as first cause, but in functional operation, natural laws maintain order and continuity. In conceptualizing a starkly divided dualistic model of reality based on the criteria of rational thought and logic, Descartes provided the impetus for further exploration along similar lines. By envisioning reality as accurately comprehensible by the faculties of reason, and structured according to principles of logic and mathematics, the conception of God, with all associated qualitative attributes, must necessarily be carefully envisioned to account for both appearances and meanings of deeper significance. One approach was to simply think of virtually distinct worlds of value and of fact. Going back to Plato and Aristotle, the dilemma of conceptually accounting for and resolving the relationship between divergent poles of a duality required intricate and ingenious techniques of explication and formulation. With Plato, the domain of reason was elevated to a transcendent stature, qualitatively distinct from the world of the senses. The very purpose and aim of human life in the lower world was to recognize and aspire to attain cognizance of that higher level. And with Aristotle, it is the observable and perceivable world from which all deduction proceeds. Any transcendent or superior function subsides in the world itself, whether as the indwelling impetus in organic process or as the provocative lure towards ideals and values pertaining to personal and social life. By the time of Descartes, largely as a result of the new knowledge from science and mathematics, there emerged a recognition of a more complex and extensively connected mechanistic objective dimension of experience. And in conjunction with the revival of a more self-confident and assured trust in reason and its capacities, a deeper kind of dualism developed. Conceptions about the world of nature were undergoing radical revision in terms of the basic premises assumed to be underlying how reality was being envisioned. The shift in orientation initiated with Copernicus perhaps being the greatest stimulus in reassessing the credibility of the prevailing ideational structure. And concurrently, as the most trustworthy and truth-confirming power of mind, reason, as revealed through mathematical and logical functions, became a major defining trait of the human ego. And ego, defined by functions of reason, was elevated in some contexts to equation with, or essence of, soul. Prosh wrote in his Genesis of 20th-century philosophy. Descartes was led into dualism by his own method of inquiry. Having found that an idea was indubitable if it were clear and distinct, he used this touchstone to assure himself of the existence of himself and his ideas. He had a clear and distinct apprehension of their existence, so they must exist. At the same time he had a clear and distinct idea of something extended, flexible, and mobile, something clearly and distinctly unlike thought. So it too must exist. Thought was immaterial, unextended and even eternal in one sense at least, and the other something, matter, was not. Thought could be about matter, but it could not be matter. So Descartes became a dualist, who claimed that there are just two different kinds of things in the world, thought and matter, neither of which could be reduced to the other or explained as simply a part of the other. So man for him became a peculiar being in that somehow in him were joined mind or thought stuff consciousness, consisting of feelings, perceptions, concepts, etc. and extended stuff, body, or matter. And somehow or other, in man, they affected each other. But speculation about the location of the interaction did nothing to resolve the conceptual problem of understanding how there could be any interaction. In a dualism based on separate spheres within a rational order, world of mechanism and matter on one side, thinking self, ego or soul on the other, the ideational location of God as representative of qualitative value and superordinate ontological presence becomes increasingly problematical. With Descartes, the deduction of the idea of God as the perfect being, known innately, became a logical necessity. Yet the terms of the duality were still related in a somewhat artificial and awkward conceptual construct. With Spinoza, the orientation is also towards a duality between ideas, or thought, and things, or extension, although each is subsumed in the notion of God as the one absolutely infinite substance. Thought and extension are attributes of God, and reflect a rational order which is imparted indirectly through various principles, forms, and relationships in this ideational system. God operates both fully macrocosmically through the principles of reason and microcosmically within the world of objects. Spinoza said, "The order and connection of ideas is the same as the order and connection of things. God's power of thinking is equal to his realized power of action." For Spinoza, the existence of separate domains of ideas and things necessitates God's active presence for both terms of the equation, as power of thinking, and as power of action. Reality is conceived as manifesting via immanent causality with a series of attributes, finite and infinite modes, comprehended through geometrical representation in the form of various definitions, propositions, proofs, corollaries and axioms. Spinoza places a more intensive qualitative signification onto the rational sphere, infusing the principles and processes of reason with characteristics and qualities often found in the domain of religion and values. Ethics and metaphysics are conceived as necessarily correlated, with human thought and behavior deriving transcendent legitimacy from proper knowledge and contemplation of God's attributes. He wrote, Prop. 24. The more we understand particular things, the more do we understand God. Prop. 25. The highest endeavor of the mind, and the highest virtue is to understand things by the third kind of knowledge. Proof. The third kind of knowledge proceeds from an adequate idea of certain attributes of God to an adequate knowledge of the essence of things, and, in proportion as we understand things more in this way, we better understand God. Therefore, the highest virtue of the mind, that is, the power, or nature, our highest endeavor of the mind is to understand things by this third kind of knowledge. The progressive ascent of reason starts with understanding the nature. The progressive ascent of reason starts with the understanding of the nature of objective reality, particular things. God is known through his attributes, and the more they are discerned through the operations of reason, the more completely, an adequate knowledge of the essence of things, becomes possible. Knowledge of the particular confirms knowledge of the universal. So, as we better understand things in this way, we better understand God. This is the highest virtue of the mind, and the endeavor of the mind, thus becomes an ethical imperative as well as an exercise in rationalistic construction. The Cartesian duality is represented by still differentiating separate spheres of extension and thought, even though these were conceptually subsumed as attributes of God, the one eternal substance. Spinoza's ethical and spiritual envisioning of reason legitimizes it as a qualitatively significant function. Yet the ideational system remains grounded primarily on certain presumptions of logic and mathematics, and is thus forced to maintain a delicate balance in accounting for the relationship between the poles of the duality. Leibniz extended the duality by his theory of monads, or a class of entirely self-contained separate egos or souls operating in a world where the powers of the mind are hypothesized as the very means by which God operates, but which are interpreted as a priori attributes of God, subsequently endowed in man. He wrote thusly, "The idea of things which exists in us is exclusively due to the fact that God, the author of both things and the mind, has endowed our mind with this power to infer from its own operations the truths which correspond perfectly to those of external things." The rationalist approach cannot avoid attributing inclusive and special significance to the powers of reason. Envisioned as the most true and credible means of understanding the nature of reality, connection must be found to the realm of values, purpose and meaning for the fullest representation and consolidation. Thus the valuation and elevation of reason in a number of specific constructions basically turns it into a quasi-transcendent function, grounded essentially in a reality perceived more substantive than the world of appearances. Although partaking in and pertaining to the world of normal experience through whatever conceptual apparatus is deemed appropriate, reason yet is something not restricted to those conditions. In contrast to this basic orientation, other systems of thought emerged, starting with other sets of premises about the nature and place of reason. From the point of view of the British empirical philosophers, reason was more connected to the operation of the senses than it was an a priori given. John Locke began the defense of sense-based knowledge by examining the human understanding. He denied the existence of innate ideas, believing ideas were derived from sense experience. He thought that there were two sources of ideas, sensation and reflection. The mind begins as a tabula rasa, or clean slate, with no prior knowledge, acquiring them through experience. Ideas were of two types, simple and complex. Simple ideas came from the input of the senses, complex ideas through the combining, abstracting, relational acts of mind. All ideas he thought were capable of being broken down into basic ideas, named modes. These were dependent on other things, or substances, on particular things, which were self-dependent, and relations, which were definable only in the context of other ideas. And as well, Locke thought that experience had both quantitative aspects, which were primary, and qualitative aspects, which were secondary. These qualities were located in substance. This framework of description and interpretation differed from the rationalists in that it places experience first and denies first principles. However, this orientation also is forced to look beyond the logical, conceptual, rational functional operations of mind. Locke made allowance for an experiential dimension of emotions, or passions, which were still conceived as subordinate to the intellect. Reason, intellect, the rational mental processes were perceived as coming from input of the senses and internal synthetic operations of the mind. He argued like this: let us then suppose the mind to be, as we say, white paper, void of all characters, without any ideas. How comes it to be furnished? Whence comes it by that vast store, which the busy and boundless fancy of man has painted on it with an almost endless variety? Whence has it all the materials of reason and knowledge? To this I answer, in one word: from experience, in that all our knowledge is founded, and from that it ultimately derives itself. Our observation, employed either about external sensible objects, or about the internal operations of our minds, perceived and reflected on by ourselves, is that which supplies our understanding with all the materials of thinking. These two are the fountains of knowledge, from whence all the ideas we have, or can naturally have, do spring. As we see, Locke's interpretation of the nature of the mind encompasses the data of sensation and thought, observation, about external sensible objects, and internal operations of our minds. Ideas derive from both the rational cognizing, intellectual operations of the mind along with input from other sources of experience, together making the two fountains of knowledge. The materials of thinking, thus derive from a dual source, synthesized through the natural operations of the mind, combined internally through a variety of mental activities. Berkeley and Hume began with Locke's basic perspective and moved further along similar lines. Berkeley used reductive logical argumentation to suggest that a self-existent objective world was not necessarily required by logic, and that subjective perception was the only way of validating reality. That, to be is to be perceived. According to Berkeley, some truths that are so near and obvious to the mind that a man need only open his eyes to see them. Such I take this important one to be, viz. that all the choir of heaven and furniture of the earth, in a word all those bodies which compose the mighty frame of the world, have not any subsistence without a mind, that their being is to be perceived or known, that consequently so long as they are not actually perceived by me, or do not exist in my mind or that of any other created spirit, they must either have no existence at all, or else subsist in the mind of some eternal spirit. Hume felt knowledge could only be of perceptions, held together by associations, with relations discoverable only through experience. The capacity to know universal truths was impossible according to Hume, who thought only probabilities could be discerned. Hume expressed it thusly: knowledge is nothing but a bundle or collection of different perceptions, which succeed each other with an inconceivable rapidity, and are in a perpetual flux and movement. Our eyes cannot turn in their sockets without varying our perceptions. Our thought is still more variable than our sight, and all our other senses and faculties contribute this change, nor is there any single power of the soul, which remains unalterably the same, perhaps for one moment. The mind is a kind of theater, where several perceptions successively make their appearance, pass, repass, glide away, and mingle in an infinite variety of postures and situations. With knowledge coming from the bundle or collection of different perceptions, which succeed each other with an inconceivable rapidity, and are in a perpetual flux and movement, we see a conceptualization of the mind as a processing instrument, working on the flow of phenomenal perceptions, itself a part of the process. As kind of a theater, there is the inference of the mind being a quasi-passive mechanism, functionally organizing the data of the senses and of thought and allowing them to attain a state of coherence as they mingle in an infinite variety of postures and situations. With the empiricists, the focus is on reconciling the two poles of mental experience, those of perceptions and thoughts, knowledge and reason, from a perspective in which the data of immediate experience, or observation, perception, retains primary status when synthesized under more inclusive categories and classifications. The principles of reason are conceived as dependent themselves on the grounds of experience, while the rationalists conceived of a priori guiding and shaping principles pre-existent and determinative of the way experience is perceived. Both rationalist and empirical envisioning reflect purely intellectual and conceptual lines of reasoning, argumentation, analysis, description, deduction, classification, but when such speculation tries to become systematically inclusive, it must reach out and try to incorporate the elements of meaning, purpose, value. So inevitably we see the grafting and amendment of notions, beliefs, ideas, ideals from other parts of the cultural compendium being thrown into the mix. Yet rather than being necessary components of the foundation, these secondary elements are often simply intellectual artifices, useful for embellished description and for connecting the conceptual apparatus to a legitimating source of wider cultural esteem and valuation. As well, it is equally likely that the creators of such encompassing intellectually constructed systems draw from their own personal, non-intellectual, pole of experience and mix in their own, alogical, feelings, beliefs, values, ideals. While the rationalist and empirical philosophers, schools, circles, worked over the same conceptual ground, the enterprise of philosophy itself served as a supporting intellectual institution for continued speculation and revision of the broad parameters of the social representation of reality. Especially in conjunction with the growing compendium of scientific knowledge and theory. As well, throughout the different social and cultural milieus, the valuation of the individual, of reason, the power of thought, of human dignity, etc., as general influences of the philosophic enterprise, were infiltrating and affecting how reality was being envisioned. However, despite wider spread esteem and respect, the contemporary rationalist and empirical schools were unable to achieve a completely convincing and inclusive synthesis of knowledge. That changed with Kant, as philosophy attained an increased status as legitimizing authority. As a system of influence, Kant's framework of envisioning reality was extremely significant in the Western intellectual milieu, recognized as defining and inclusive, summing up and synthesizing all philosophical thought to that point in time and establishing the framework for determining how reality could be known and what could be said about it. A premise of Kant's philosophy is that experience is given coherence, structure, becomes knowable through operations of the organizational categories of the mind. The shaping and ordering principles are rational in nature, are a priori universal truths which treat and make cognizable the things in themselves of the noumenal, or transcendentally ideal, world. As functional components of this process, Kant hypothesizes about the sensory faculty, which provides the input of the data of knowledge, and the intellectual faculty, which shapes the data into knowable form and into ideas. Sensibility is both passive and active, and the source of intuition. The understanding organizes these intuitions, though there also are original intuitions of reason, such as of space and time, which are necessary modes for perceiving the phenomenal world. In his concept of the understanding, Kant saw two faculties: those of judgment and the critique of reason itself. He felt there are innate categories which are the forms of the judgment, which are discernible through logic. He concluded that there were 12 categories, reducible to 4 groups. The first, that of quantity, gave unity, plurality, totality. The second, quality, gave reality, negation, limitation. The third, relation, gave subsistence and inherence, causality and dependence, reciprocity. The fourth, modality, gave possibility, existence, necessity. These were the categories Kant believed organized and shaped our knowledge of experience. As well, he believed that the experiencing self was a unity. Where Hume saw association of ideas, Kant thought in terms of a synthetic unity of apperception in arriving at the concept of the self. One of the important conclusions from the Kantian system was the distinction between phenomena and noumena. Kant thought that reason cannot go beyond phenomenal experience without arriving at antinomies. However, a world of noumena can be inferred and logically hypothesized, while mathematics and physics were the most trustworthy means of providing knowledge of phenomena. When it came to connecting the conceptualized vision of an intellectually and rationally consistent construct with the material of experience pertaining to the domain of emotion, feeling, intuition, imagination, and all elements of the other pole of subjective experience, Kant postulated the theory of practical reason. Since the principles of pure reason are devoid of subjective qualitative reference, the moral, religious, personal, ethical, behavioral dimensions were relegated to a separate field of processes and relationships. However, the spheres of pure and practical reason were considered to be mutually interdependent, the conceptual system providing the defining and legitimizing ground for interpreting the reality of actual experience. Influenced by the Newtonian scientific comprehensive worldview, Kant felt that he had created a Copernican revolution in philosophy. Assuming Newton's scientific model was the final state of scientific knowledge, Kant's system accounted for empirical, rational, experiential modes of experience, and explored the presumed limits of reason, sense, speculative thought, in its entirety, appearing to provide a fully comprehensive framework for a philosophical envisioning of reality. In the full confidence of the all-encompassing completeness of his system, Kant even encouraged the activity of metaphysical speculation. Not as a means of acquiring true knowledge or insight, but as a means of intellectual discipline and guidance. Kant wrote it like this: "Metaphysics is the full and complete development of human reason, quite apart from its influence, as science, in conjunction with certain specific ends, it is an indispensable discipline. For in dealing with reason it treats of those elements and highest maxims which must form the basis of the very possibility of some sciences, and of the use of all. That As mere speculation, it serves rather to prevent errors than to extend knowledge, does not detract from its value. On the contrary, this gives it dignity and authority, through that censorship which secures general order and harmony. By showing the limitations of metaphysical thinking, the inability of intellect to know things in themselves, and the relationship of pure to practical reason, Kant, as with Newton, stands as a master of synthesis and summation of a specific tradition of knowledge, encompassing and reshaping the diverse threads leading to that point in time and providing a framework which satisfactorily articulates an authoritative vision of reality. In distinguishing between phenomena and noumena, Kant's thought was carried in two directions. By sanctioning science and mathematics as the proper means of treating phenomenal knowledge, Kant inspired realist, or naturalist, schools of philosophy. The hypothetical apparatus of noumena could pragmatically be dispensed with while the data of experience remained the main source of interest. Scientific as well as philosophical speculation drew this perspective from his system. And by constructing an intricate encompassing system with mind as the preeminent reality, idealism emerged with a solid foundation for future speculative stimulus. By emphasizing the role of the subject, the place of values and moral connections to the greater reality, Kant exerted a wide influence in a number of cultural applications. Kant's Critique of Pure Reason was published in 1781, and he died in 1804, setting the stage for a century in which philosophy, as a legitimizing institution, reached a certain pinnacle of esteem and credibility, yet only to recede as science emerged as an encompassing independent authoritative ideational institution. We will soon look at the scientific channel of legitimization. Right now we will follow the Kantian idealist influence in formal philosophic thought.